Welcome, welcome. Testing one, two, three. I'm sure you guys can all hear me. But today we are doing the WriteLife podcast. We are figuring out times to really get this down. We're shooting for about 1:30 Mountain Standard Time. I'll be with you guys for about 15 minutes, just kind of share a lesson, and this will be on the post and on the YouTube channel later for anybody who wants to kind of learn more about the Right Life podcast and what we're trying to do here. This is sponsored by Prolific, my company, and I just want to talk today about the foundation of story and how it plays out into people's lives. So, really, what it means is like when we're writing a story, oftentimes people will think of stories as just like these collection of tropes or these collection of like dialogue or a cool plot line or whatever. Well, what we don't realize is that the reason story attaches to us is because psychologically, as human beings, we run our lives through story. Like narrative is one of the biggest draws that compels us through our lives. And so you see, like, just in terms of like news media or how we interact with the internet or even with other people, the narratives we hold and the stories that are playing in our lives have a huge impact on what we see. So today, I'm here to talk about and explore what that means specifically and what it means, kind of how we apply it prolific, but more importantly, just what story means in your life, right? And the story you're telling yourself, right? So let's talk about the three foundational pillars of story as kind of coined by my understanding of it, and then define what those are. So the first three pillars, and I need to get like a proper whiteboard and stuff like that. I actually had one, left it at home, so sorry guys, but we'll just have to listen well. We'll get the visual aids up shortly, I promise. Um, but the most important thing to really understand is that the three big pillars that we have are character, setting, and premise, right? And let's see actually if we can pull up like at least another side document or whatever that I can work on with you guys that at least show you that, because this is a really key factor to understand is that character, setting, and premise are like we can break down these pillars in the story. Obviously, we understand how it works in terms of writing like a novel or watching a movie, but how does that mean in your life, right? And that's a really important thing, and it's not disconnected. So, for instance, in your life, your character, right, is that fundamental sense of being, right? And that's a really, really important part. And one of the things is um, your foundation of being is so critical to the direction your life takes and what happens. I am surprised people don't talk about it more, even though it's been something that's come up for millennia. And oftentimes we'll talk about like what a man thinketh is so maketh him, and the idea of like think and grow rich, and the idea of your thoughts really catapulting who you are. But I think sometimes we forget that thoughts emanate from our being, and oftentimes we'll talk about characters and why we like them, but there's so little critical self-analysis, I think, in this day and age. There's a lot of self-consciousness, which is not the same as being actually conscious of self or aware of self, that oftentimes we lose track of what that is. So I'm going to see if I can add a little something, a little um, something that you guys can see. But I think it's really important to understand like what exactly we're trying to do when we, I guess, sort of build our lives up and become more, right? Because part of really enhancing and becoming stronger with story, right, is we have to understand that story is one of these things that comes together based on the narrative we hold within ourselves. And so here we have character at the top, right? And after character, now character is essentially your being. Now this is how you show up in the world. So something I want everyone to think about is like, how do I show up in the world? Because this is like one of the most important things to understand is that everything comes from inside out. And I feel like that's a fairly obvious truth, but more and more I'm seeing that it's becoming lost on people. People don't really think of it. They think, well, it's the government, or it's because of this person, or it's because of where I was born. Like, oftentimes people are just talking about things outside of themselves, which is actually the next thing to talk about. But this factor is an important one, as we know in any story, but it's only the secondary factor to the character, and that is the setting, right? And so, setting is traditionally the environment uh, place takes place in, a story takes place in, or the character finds themselves in. But environment is more, oh, I spelled that wrong. Environment is more than just like the physical setting, right? But it's also like what is um, the atmosphere and the time period, as well as the influence it has on the people living inside of it, right? All these things build and make setting. And so when you think of setting, think about the environments you're in. That's your home, that's your city, your state, and also think about sort of like the atmosphere or the culture that kind of makes that. All these things are setting. And setting is one of the biggest factors, obviously, in sort of determining the way a character moves. But you're going to see this the next part that I come to see. This is probably, I wouldn't say the most important pillar, but it's the one we most easily recognize in stories of fiction, but have a hard time identifying in our own lives. And that's premise, which is, I would say, either your purpose or direction in life, right? The premise is the purpose or the direction of the story. The genre of the story is taking place in the general direction it's trying to move in. And that's a really, really key factor in our own lives. Like, what is the purpose of one's life, right? Oftentimes, without knowing it, we'll plug in to someone else's purpose or premise agenda that's been set by them because they're in the setting, whether it's a company or your parents or, this idea of a God, even though, like, I believe in God, but just whatever you have this idea of this greater thing coming from outside of you and therefore compelling your purpose forward. And that's when the setting overpowers the character. And we see that these three fundamental pillars sort of make up the structure of story. Now, obviously, we're here today to talk about the foundation of story sort of in your own life. And the foundation of story in your own life is understanding that first and foremost, the number one thing is character. That's the first priority, right? Because it's the thing, especially we in our own lives, have the biggest control over. Even when writing a story, you see that writing the character will oftentimes define the direction of a story. A story can be made or be broken by virtue of the main character in it. So I would just say, how are we showing up as the main character in your own life? Because that's super key. How do you show up in the world, right? And that very world itself, this is the second priority, is the setting, right? And then it's what is the impact of the setting on the people in it. Now, when I say the people within it, we have to understand that setting can exist in and of itself, right? But its only purpose is given really when a character interacts with the setting. So a good example is, let's say, I'm living in a farmhouse, there's chickens, there's cows, there's pigs or whatever, and then I add a character who's a farmer, he has a child, right? He has a family, it's all good. So we have the premise and purpose of the direction is to be a happy family that's going and taking care of each other. But then I can change something in the setting, right? I can create a tornado that comes. And then suddenly the premise change, and then you have a story because there's a conflict where there's pressure of the setting grinding against character. And then through that grinding or that impact, that clash of setting and character coming together, you'll ultimately get your premise, the third point in this arc, right? Or the third part. Now, I don't say priority because it just naturally will happen or occur as you focus on character. And as you build character and understand the setting, the natural conflicts which arise from the character's survival or trying to live within the setting is what's going to create that pressure which will then manifest in your story or your premise. And so it's all pretty simple, right? And that same principle applies to you in your own life. Think about it. You have your personality, your sense of being, your character, and then you interact with the world around you. Now, you might have dreams, hopes, ideals, and the trials through that will define the story. So, for me, for instance, like my character is you know, I want to write, own an animation studio, and travel a ton, and I love women. That sounds silly, but let's say that. Like, I love women. So naturally, within the setting, right, the things that are going to come up is what are the barriers or obstacles to write. So obviously, I have to make money, right? I have to have a place to live, and I have to educate myself within the world, right? So those are the natural challenges that happen because I live in a capital-based economy, and there's opportunities, but there's some opportunities that are there for the taking, some aren't. So then the story, my premise, is built upon this the pressure of me, my own character, trying to move forward towards my dreams, towards my goals, and coming into conflict with the setting, right? And therefore, that's my story. That's the guy who makes the YouTube videos that nobody watches, the guy who writes the books that nobody reads, or whatever, and then works to get people to read them, who builds the company, like that's what makes the story compelling. That's what makes my life compelling, right? Because it's that trial that comes right before the triumph. And in being able to do that, it's super important that we understand that fundamentally story is always playing out in our lives, whether it's just you, or it's your loved ones, or specifically anything you're working out. Your story is always playing out, and it's this fundamental foundation of understanding, hey, I'm moving towards something that builds the story and makes it compelling. And so one of the things you really want to ground yourself in, and this is a big line that I'm going to say again and again, especially as you start watching my videos and exploring my content, is that the narrative world within you and in your mind is more real than the waking world around you. And what that means to say is that human beings, think about it. So right now, I'm in the library. This is a building of steel and concrete and glass. And human beings, we struggle with environments, but the environment was man-made. Think about that. I live in a city, there's asphalt, there's train tracks right across from me, and I have all this stuff around me, and I have to learn how to survive in this environment. But that's the setting being shaped by man, by human beings. Think about that. Because not too many animals, most animals are very comfortable living just in the natural world. They come in, they just live in their environments and they excel. But human beings, we came in, we were vulnerable, almost alien to our natural environment, so much so that we started to shape it, right? So how can that be more true than any other story we make? And we will realize, like, in a compelling story, that's what drives it forward, is the human being taking their character, that narrative world within inside themselves. The guys in Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers, when they said, "Hey, we want to fly this plane," and then making it fly, and therefore changing the world. Or Alexander Graham Bell being like, "Hey, I want to take these phone lines and talk to people all over the world," and making it happen. It's taking this idea or this grain of imagination, planting it in the ground of setting, and therefore changing the setting. And that's what human ingenuity is, and that's what fundamentally character is, and how it works with setting. And then through that, we get the story, which is the premise, right? And so when you understand these foundations of stories, you understand, like, there's a natural flow. And that natural flow is not just some random trope or something you pick up in a book to try and understand story. The reason we think that way is because it's naturally occurring within our environment. If you just pay enough attention to life, you'll see, obviously, this is how stories function and how they would always function. So this is the most important thing to always be mindful of, is just that, of course, if I just pay attention to life, I'll be able to write better. Because you can never tell a story beyond your own depth of character. And that's the toughest thing, is that if you're not a very deep or experienced person, you can't write stories that are deep and experienced too. And so that's the biggest deal, is that as you go and as you grow, so goes your story. So that is the foundation of story, and just a little 15-minute lesson I wanted to give you guys today. And I hope it was helpful. I hope it was good, trying to keep it short and succinct, and try to give you guys just a little something to chew on. It will be sitting on, obviously, my YouTube and my Facebook. But ultimately, guys, just remember, like, the foundation of story starts in your life. So really try to live your story, be the main character in your life, and the rest will follow. Now, it's Friday, so I'm on week one of Operation Goose Rocket. And so if you guys don't know that, you'll see the YouTube video kind of detailing it more. But basically, what I'm trying to do is basically give myself a foundation of habits so that I can kind of excel and grow some major milestones that I've placed using three pillars of my career that I'm trying to build on, which is my YouTube channel, my writing, and my personal business, my writer education business. So if you want to see that story unfold, check out Goose Rocket, and by my example, sort of just check out how we're moving the chains and coming along. I really appreciate you guys all showing up, and it's super great. Uh, Thanks so much. Stay happy, stay healthy, and stay tuned for more prolific writing and Oni Onyeabor or Peter Clampton. Take care, stay happy, stay healthy. Signing out. Peace.